Well, joining us this evening from Rome, we're very excited. Our next guest recently conducted the first extensive interview of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate. Elise Allen is senior correspondent for Crux, an independent Catholic news service that aims to be an objective voice in Catholic media. She covers the Vatican and the global church and is the author of the new biography, Leo XIV, Citizen of the World, Missionary of the 21st Century, for which she sat down with Pope Leo for a wide-ranging two-part interview. The book is already available in Spanish with English and Portuguese editions coming in early 2026. Welcome to the Busted Halo Show, Elise Allen.
Thank you, Father David. It's wonderful to be with you.
And thank you so much. I'm grateful for you joining us from Rome. I understand there's a time difference, so we appreciate your commitment.
No, I'm happy to, for you, I'm happy to do anything.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Of course, many of our listeners remember John Allen, who works with you at Crux, who had a show on the Catholic Channel for many years. So our greetings to John. And you work with a lot, I would imagine, a lot of Americans who are sort of like yourself, let's say expats over in Rome, who tend to bring us back news of the Catholic Church and the Vatican, but who kind of have anchored their lives there like you have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a nice little expat community here, and it keeps us, in good company and, from causing too much trouble up to our own devices, I guess.
Well, that's good. So we were very excited here on the Busted Halo Show to see that you had sat down with Pope Leo, not just for the first, American interview. This is honestly the first, long-form, extensive interview that anyone has done with him. So first of all, kudos, and I guess we get points now because we're Americans, and he hails from here. But first of all, before we get into his content and what your biography is going to shape up to be, what was that like for you? Because you had known him prior to his election to the Pope, right?
Yeah, I had actually met Robert Prevost in 2018 when I was in Peru doing a reporting trip. So he was still Bishop of Chiclayo at the time, and I remember being very impressed, that an American ended up bishop in another country, and I was like, how does this happen, and then of course it's through the missionary activity, right? And that's in Peru, that's a fairly common thing. You have a lot of foreign missionaries who have been elevated over the decades, so I'd actually met him first on that occasion, and then of course when he came to Rome, when Francis appointed him to Rome, and, as head of the dicastery for bishops, and he was made a cardinal, we paid a courtesy visit, when he got here, just as fellow Americans to say, welcome, and you're welcome in our home anytime, and so we had contact here and there, over the arc of the 2 years, prior to the conclave and his election. And he did come over to our house at one point in October of last year. So,
came to your home.
Yes, we had dinner at our house.
Because John makes a mean, what is it, carbonara? What does he make?
He makes a mean everything, pretty much. But cacio e pepe is what we cooked the night.
Cacio e pepe, that's what I thought.
We made cacio e pepe the night that, now Pope Leo came over.
Right. So this was something maybe for you, therefore, as an interviewer, as a reporter, it wasn't quite as intimidating since he'd been over to your house, but still, here you are sitting down with the Vicar of Christ and asking him questions for a couple hours.
Yeah, it was, as a reporter, it's very exciting. You have the nerves, you have, anytime you're interviewing somebody at that level, it comes with, just some pre-packed anxiety, but I did not too much, as you said, because I had known him previously and seeing him in that context, walking towards me and why, and I'd seen him as Pope before that, but I hadn't seen him in a private context since,
Right.
So it was very strange at first, and then immediately it was just like, they're like, oh, how are you? How's John? And, it was very comfortable. It's like, okay, he's just Robert Prevost,
Right.
he's Pope Leo, but he's the same guy, and why should that change? And so we were both, I think, a little nervous with the first question or two, and then that just eased in,
Right.
and it was very much a conversation. And I think he enjoyed reflecting on all the steps of his life. You could tell he was remembering things that were important to him, and that there are things that had touched him or special moments along the way of his own vocation and his own missionary life that were very important and foundational to who he is, and as a person, but also as a pastor. So it was nice to be able to see him in that context and to see him so reflective and so open. And that's what impressed me most about him, I think, is just his openness and how sincere and honest and transparent he wanted to be with his answers.
Well, and as I mentioned before, this is really the first major interview that he's agreed to. I remember, Elise, in 2013, when Pope Francis went to Rio de Janeiro for World Youth Day, and I'm fairly sure, at least in my memory, this is how it is, that somewhere around that time, maybe not on the way back on the plane, but somewhere really close to that, there was news that the Pope had sat down with some news that were like the 60 Minutes of South America or something like that for a long form interview, and I thought, oh, silly, popes don't do that. They don't submit to interviews from the press, and I remember thinking that, and then all of a sudden, of course, obviously that opened a maelstrom of Pope Francis sitting down for interviews, some off the cuff on the plane, and some kind of long form. So it feels like Pope Leo is okay continuing at least somewhat in that vein. Because it was, I mean, prior to Pope Francis, it wasn't like we were in the dark ages of, print. There were TV interviews that it just seemed like it wasn't, protocol or wasn't the thing to do for a pope. But it seems like now that's more normative.
Well, I think Benedict started that trend when he did there was the Light of the World series. It was a 3-part interview biography. So similar to what I did a bit, but he sat down with Peter Sewald, a German journalist, and they did this sort of autobiographical interview thing, but it came out as a biography, but an interview, biography. And so he really kind of opened up the more modern papal interview. Francis, of course, took that to all new levels.
Yeah.
Every week we're getting a new interview, and then, as journalists, we got bored with it after a while. We're like, okay, he said the same thing, that he said last week, and Leo,
or as journalists, you're working hard to say, no, what he really meant was.
Yeah, we try to report, not interpret.
That's true. I'm sorry.
choice.
That's the Vatican press office has to say what he really meant was.
Yeah, what he really meant was, But I'd say, no, this is what he meant. This is what he said, and it's really interesting,
Right.
I think Leo's going to have a different approach to interviews. I think, again, fundamentally, he accepted this project. Number one, because we did have prior contact, and he felt there was a certain comfort level there. He felt like I was going to do it right and respect his story. But also, this was not a hard hitting news interview. I mean, the last part of it was a little more hot topic, the hot button issues, or more relevant and current issues. But this was a biography, and this was about him and his life. And I think he liked that. He knows, he reads, he's aware there are a lot of books being written about him, and I think he liked the opportunity to, having the opportunity to make sure at least one of those, is,
in his words.
Contribution.
In telling the story, right.
To tell his own story. And I think he liked that. And of course it was for Peru, because this is released first of all in Peru for Penguin Peru. So I think he's somebody.
And was that part of the, he really desired that, or was that your idea, or how did that come about?
No, I was approached by Penguin Peru to do this. I had a contact with Penguin Random House in Peru, their Peru division, from months prior to the conclave. And after Leo was elected, they said, okay, we know somebody who's also American that has a history of and knowledge of Peru, and who also knows the Vatican. So they asked me to do a book in Spanish about Pope Leo.
Wow.
I said, you'll have to clean it up, but okay. So I wrote it in Spanish. And they cleaned it.
Yeah.
So it was not.
We are talking to one of the first biographers of Pope Leo XIV, Elise Allen, joining us from Crux, the independent Catholic news service, joins us from Rome this evening. And the new book we're talking about, being released in Peru and soon available in English, is Leo XIV, Citizen of the World, Missionary of the 21st Century. Obviously, Elise, a lot of the talk when the name first came from the balcony and everybody tries to start spinning and figuring out what that is that certainly he's an American born in the United States, but spent a lot of time as a missionary. I heard some of the cardinals after the fact saying that, well, he was, in a sense, the least American, meaning that in terms of their ability, because everybody said it would never be an American, never be American. So he was kind of maybe instead of the least American, but like the most possible American. It has seemed to me, at least, that in the time since then, that I don't find that to be ringing true. I find him to be fairly proudly American whenever every Sunday audience Wednesday audience and Sunday Angelus, when he's greeting the various people from various countries and he says United States, he gets that little smirk and everybody cheers more loudly and all that. So it doesn't seem like he's overly trying to be not American.
Yeah, no, he very much embraces his American, background. He's very proud to be American, and it's obvious in his mannerisms, his thinking, his styles. He's very much your classic type A American, personality. And he's been very open with his sports affiliations. I think we all know where his allegiances lie. And I don't know if you remember, there was one audience, a general audience, where somebody had a box of Aurelia's pizza
The
from
pizza.
Chicago.
Oh God, we talked
They
about
brought
that
him
on
the
this show.
pizza. I interviewed him after that audience. The second interview happened after that audience. And when I asked him, I was like, what do you do with that? Like the pizza. And he's like, well, I had a pizza lunch. So we ate the Aurelia's pizza.
Why not? They brought it all the way from the States. Yeah.
So he very much identifies with his Chicago roots and with the United States. Obviously, he has a special love for Peru, but he does feel very American at heart.
And yet, and again, one of the descriptors of him around the time of his election, and I think I see reflected in even just literally the title of your book, is that he's not sort of just an American. He's not provincial. He's not only thinking with American eyeglasses. He's not seeing the world that way. He really is a true missionary. A lot of them called him a true missionary. Is that your sense?
Absolutely. And the perspective that he has in that sense is so unique because he is American. He comes from that background, but he spent, 20 years plus, as serving in Peru as a missionary. He knows Latin America very well, specifically the Peruvian context, but also he was superior of his global religious order, the Augustinians, for 12 years. So I think he's one of the very few cardinals that had that global perspective, like managing an order globally prior to come to his election. Francis was never head of the Jesuits, coming into that. So he didn't even have that global experience as a global pastor in that sense already that Leo had. So Leo traveled, to 4 countries in his time, as prior general, a lot of time in Africa, a lot of time in Asia, where the order is growing most, and throughout Europe and Latin America. So he's somebody that had a very rich experience already going into this and very knowledgeable about not just the Augustinian order, but the church in throughout the world, because of his travels and his experience there.
You talked about your time sitting down with Pope Leo in 2 different times, one of which was the day you got the pizza brought over to him. But now that you mentioned that it was the folks, the Penguin Random House in Peru, that contacted you, wanted you to write in Spanish. We know that he's obviously fluent in English and Spanish. What did you talk to him in English, Spanish? Were you like Duolingoing? Like, I got to get this down before I write the book. What was the interview like? Was it entirely in English?
It was entirely in English, yeah. Although, because we both do speak Spanish, they're in Peruvian Spanish, there were some like idioms or some little expressions that, he would say, and like raise his eyebrow. He knew that I'd understand, or I could say something and he would have that experience, we could say a phrase or a term in Spanish, and know that the other would understand it. So sometimes that happened throughout the interview, and so that was kind of fun. It added a fun dynamic to it, just because we do both have not just a background in the language, but culturally of Peru as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, the book we're talking about is Leo XIV, Citizen of the World, Missionary of the 21st Century, by our guest, Elise Allen, joining us from Rome this evening. It is already available in Peru and published in Spanish, so you could read it in Spanish. But English translations and Portuguese translations coming too. So those are the next 2. Usually for Vatican stuff, for a pope, we start with Latin, and then we go down the line. But we're starting here with Spanish, and then Portuguese, and English. Let's talk a little bit, Elise.
First, French is coming in November.
Oh, great. Oh, nice. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit, certainly about the content. And obviously it was an interview for a biography, so you asked him about his whole life and his growing up and all that. I think a lot of our listeners are on the edge of their seats, like, what's his position on this? And certainly that, like you said, that's what a lot of the secular media wants to know. What did he say about, gays or women in the church, whatever it is? But you asked a question that would have been one of the top on my mind. You didn't ask me to interview him, but so I'm glad you did. I'm glad you had the gig about peace, because he really. It seems more than a lot of other words or concepts from the very moment he stepped out on the balcony until even just recently, he seems to keep hammering that down, almost in an echoing, even though he took his namesake from a different pope, but kind of John the 23rd in that sense of just like, we need peace on the earth here. That was his one of John the 23rd's famous encyclicals, in case that reference is escaping anybody. But I mean, it does seem that's foremost on his mind. And I like that you asked him, like, so what do we mean by that? And how can we as church kind of effect that or be brokers of peace or bridge builders, I think is what you asked him, right?
Yeah, because that's exactly, those are his first words on the balcony, peace be with you, and he talked about building bridges, and he talked about, the synodal church. And I think for him, that's all very much intertwined. And, one of the things we did talk about in the interview as well, like in addition to global conflicts, such as, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, was also polarization in the world. But the world is very deeply polarized, and so is the church. And how do you build bridges within that? How do you build peace within your own home? And I think that's something that he sees as being very much his role. I think you're absolutely right. This concept of peace is something that he sees as sort of a duty and his mission, in a sense. It's something the cardinals in the pre-conclave general congregation meetings were talking a lot about. Who can bring unity? Who can bring communion? We're in a very divided time. And it's not getting better. People are more agitated and angry and polarized. And he's somebody that sees it as his mandate to bring peace, I think, or to help try to foster that. He said very clearly, it's not my job to solve the world's problems. I'm here to encourage people in their faith. And what does that mean? Also, unity and peace in Christ, and making sure that we're unified as believers. And I think that's something he takes very seriously, and he said that too. I'm trying not to be more polarizing right now. He wants to take the temperature down. He wants people to just, let's take a breath, let's calm down a little bit, and let's try to focus on what really matters, which is the heart of the gospel message. And part of that is also peace and communion. And I think that's something, given his own personal desire, but also what he sees as a need in the church, but his own Augustinian background with the emphasis that they place on, harmonious community life. I think that's something that he is uniquely, positioned to do, and to respond to these needs in the world. And I think he sees that very much as being at the heart of his mission.
Elise Allen is our guest here on the Busted Halo Show. We're talking about her lengthy, long-form, sit-down interview with the first of its kind with Pope Leo XIV for her book, Leo XIV, Citizen of the World, Missionary of the 21st Century. And while it's only published book form in Spanish, you can read lots and lots of excerpts at Crux Now. And we've got a link on our radio blog, in case you don't know. How do you spell? Is it like crutches or with a K? No, just go to bustedhalo.com/radio. We've got all the links there to everything that you've released. So I've read portions of it. There's a lot there, but what I do remember particularly about him talking about peace, and as you just made the distinction, sometimes we think of that only, and when I made the reference to John the 23rd, the big sort of peace in the world, like Gaza, Ukraine, where there's war, let's bring peace. And yet he drew a distinction even in his own role as kind of a head of state versus the vicar of Christ and versus kind of a pastor and leader of faith. But also, as you just made in talking about this, references to how there's not peace in our own church household. And it's not just, we can't just point the finger at, Putin or Gaza or whatever else and say, look, there's a lot of disharmony among ourselves. And I'm glad you mentioned synodality and a lot of the excerpts, you had a couple of those that focused on that, on synodality, because, I mean, I've been a Catholic for all my 61 years, and I've been ordained for 25, and I only started hearing that word a couple of years ago. And so, I think at least here in the States, people still kind of roll their eyes and go, oh, that was like some word that Pope Francis came up with. Aren't we past that or what? But he makes a reference in your interview, the fact that even before it was a buzzword on our lips, that in Latin America, they were following this, quote, synodal process, meaning that they were gathering together people and having listening opportunities so that we kind of walk as church together. And he seems clear not only that he's going to continue that because it's something Francis did, but it's something that he's been a part of even before that.
No, absolutely. And I think that's part of the Latin American experience of the Second Vatican Council, too, going back to their implementation of that. And it's something that I explore in the book as well. What is their vision and what was their vision at that time? And Latin America was the first continent that had, the continental bishops conference. You know, they were the first one to have, a body like that at that level. And, you know, so they started walking together as a church, as Francis would say, we walk together, we journey together. They started doing that already. The roots of it are really in the 50s before the council. And then that takes shape much more clearly in the years afterwards. And it's based so much on the people and their own devotion. When Francis placed a lot of emphasis, right, on popular piety, popular devotion, the people's experience and wanting to be evangelized by the people. He used this language, but that comes from the Latin American experience. Throughout that continent, you really see a vibrancy in the way that people live their faith and the way they live it as a community. And you don't really have isolated parishes, like everybody sort of knows each other, and the parishes themselves are so large, but they really are these communal places where people come together and people live their faith very much as a community in a way that, I haven't seen elsewhere. It's distinct. You see that to varying degrees and to varying manifestations everywhere, but in Latin America, it is very distinct. And so when Leo, went there, he had that experience, and his very first pastoral experience, he came right out of finishing his canon law degree in Rome, he's ordained for a couple of years, had like a 2-month vacation, and then went straight to Peru. And this was his pastoral experience, and then he was put in charge and he implemented that himself. So his whole instinct as a pastor is shaped by this vision. And so he said, we were doing this thing, this walking together, kind of this collaborative style of working together, between pastor and lay people, having lay teams go out in parish zones and evangelize, do catechesis. It's sort of a collaboration that they've been doing for decades. And Francis is trying to apply that at the global level. And I think Leo's very much going to continue that vision in his own way, but he's going to do it.
And it's not entirely focused on the portion of it you just mentioned, but an important piece is a church that shares co-responsibility with clergy and laity. And I've heard a lot of conversations lately, particularly here in our North American context, where we do, vocations go up and down and some people get excited about, a little boom here and there. But in general, there's a lot more lay people than there are ordained clergy. And so, I've heard conversations about the fact that the co-responsibility, meaning journeying together, deciding together who we are as church, not deciding to change God's mind about what divine revelation is, but just kind of how we're living it out, that is important, even if there were lots and lots and lots of priestly vocations. It's not just a factor of, we don't have enough, so I guess we'll, quote, let the lay people do some stuff.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. It's the way that you live as a community. And that, it's getting rid of sort of the clericalist attitude, the clericalist mentality, where you have sort of class distinctions in the church, and say, no, we're all part of the church and we all have a role to play, but what is really the role of the pastor? To form lay people, and the way that the parishes were organized, just as an illustration of the kind of collaboration that, Robert Prevost and now Pope Leo was used to doing and implementing. The parishes were so big in Trujillo, they covered such vast amounts of territory and had so many people. You would divide the parishes into 16 or 18 different zones, and you would have coordinators. Each zone was sort of catechized. There was a lay team in charge of catechesis that would go out. They would do, communion services. They would come out with the host. They would do, liturgy of the word. They would bring basic needs to the people at aid. And so the pastors would work with the coordinators of each of these group, offer formation to them. The coordinators would work with their group, and they'd go out. And then once a month or whatever, when the pastors could, they'd come out and join, and they would do masses out there. And of course, and they'd have on Sundays a celebration at the actual physical parish when there was one, because for a lot of time it was just a patch of dirt, and people would bring a table and a tablecloth, and that's how you'd celebrate. Once the parishes were actually built, then they would come on Sundays. Then each zone has its own little feast, and people come to their, the feast celebration of the other zone. It's lived very communally, but there's also this collaboration of the pastors working directly with the lay people. Say, we would be overextended if we're trying to do all of that. Why not just let them do it? They can do all this stuff, And so it was very much a close-knit collaboration where everybody had their role, but everyone was also involved, and they were able to reach areas that they would not have been able to otherwise because of that model.
Senior correspondent for Crux, the independent Catholic news service, Elise Allen, joins us from Rome, talking about her sit-down interview with Pope Leo and soon to be available in English biography called Leo XIV, Citizen of the World, Missionary of the 21st Century. You talked about him having a perspective of being in charge of a religious community and the Augustinians having a value of their harmony when they live in community life. I'm dying to get your take, or if you dropped any little hints or questions about the fact that supposedly he's renovating the Apostolic Palace to be living with other Augustinians. What's that going to be like? I mean, it'd be great to, hey, pass the butter. Hey, we're all equal here. We're all brothers, but this guy's the Pope. What's your take on that? First of all, is that really happening? That's what we hear, but.
That's what we hear. He didn't say anything about that.
He didn't mention who's moving in. Yeah.
No, well, he didn't even say that he was moving with Augustinians. He didn't say that plan. He said he was going to move to the Apostolic Palace. Maybe a smaller apartment. Something that's a little more cozy. I don't know. But beyond that, I have no idea what his plans are.
because at least I live in community with my brothers. I just came from gathering around a table with them, and I know what that's like. And I also know what it'd be like if one of us was a bishop, let alone the Pope. That's got to be an interesting dynamic.
Sure.
Elise Allen from Crux, the independent Catholic news service, is talking about her time spent with Pope Leo. Was there anything that was surprising to you? You've known him from before when he was Cardinal Prevost, obviously, and he was comfortable enough with you that he'd been to your house in Rome before he was elected Pope. But in kind of digging in and creating what is the story of a biography, was there anything that was kind of like news to you or surprising or interesting?
No, I just say there was nothing informationally that was surprising. It was all very interesting, of course, in terms of giving you an idea of who the man is. And because I had known him a little bit before, I kind of knew what his general thinking was on most issues. There were some I think what surprised me most in that context was, again, just his openness and his transparency. He's somebody that you ask a direct question to, he wants to give you a direct answer, and as much as he can, without saying everything, of course. His personality surprised me in that sense. That it's very much the same as what I've experienced, but even in this setting, he's not intimidated very easily. He's not nervous very easily. There was nothing he was really unwilling to talk about. He finds a way to talk about everything. But there were some really nice details, I think, about himself and about his own life, his own missionary experience, his own vocation. I mean, there was one thing that he didn't tell me, but somebody else told me in the book that I was kind of like, in terms of, problem solving, that he didn't deny. So I know that it's true. And there were some problems in one of the provinces of the Augustinians in Mexico. And, in an attempt to help them, we're talking about financial issues, some promiscuity, these things happen. And he had been trying to work with the provinces and the leaders of the province to clean things up for a while, and needed to come eventually when he was superior general, because they'd been sort of resistant to the changes he was asking for, apparently. And so he came and convoked all the Augustinians in one meeting and said, I've been asking you guys, here are the problems that we've been having. These are the things I've heard and the information that's come to me. This is something I've been asking for, and I haven't seen that implemented. So, here in this briefcase, I have some of your bank statements. So either I can start reading these out loud one by one, or we can get to work.
Wow. All right. He's like, I got the goods. I got the goods right here.
Goods, but he's not afraid to, he's very sweet. And all the sweet pastor that you see is very much who he is, but he's also not afraid to take very strong action when needed. And so that's something that came across very much, also in my conversation with him, but through the stories that other people told as well.
Well, and as we're talking about taking action on things that are under the hood or things that need to be fixed, I remember at the election of Pope Francis, one of the great desires of the cardinal was, let's quote, clean up or streamline or fix, without presuming what or how much is wrong, with like the Curia, the operation of the church in the Vatican. And it seems like from your interview, because there was a good chunk on this, that he's got a strategy for continuing the reforms of Pope Francis.
No, he very much does. He said, the layout of the Roman Curia as Francis had structured it, in Predicate Evangelium, his own reform of the Curia in 2022. So that is something I want to keep, and I want to keep carrying it forward, in terms of, more global representation, perhaps more, and I would expect, more representation of the laity, more lay people getting a job inside
and the Curia, for
Curia.
people that are listening, are like, so what are these jobs we're talking about? Essentially, it's like, what, the administration of the church? Is that an easy way to put it? Or
it's the church's governing bureaucracy. So
yeah.
It's the governing apparatus of the Holy See. It's departments, it's ministries, if you will. So, he's talking about how, the basically the Vatican's governing out. Yeah, it's ministries are organized,
Sure,
and
sure,
how it functions and how they
yeah.
serve the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
So for a long time, these are led mostly by, clerics, so
Yeah, a lot of cardinals, a lot of archbishops.
A lot of cardinals, a lot of archbishops, a lot of bishops, a lot of collars in there, and more and more with Francis, you're seeing more lay people take on certain jobs in communications, or, he, I think, talked about, he didn't do it, but he talked about bringing in lay people to, lay person perhaps to run the dicastery for laity, family, and life, for example. And
well, that would make sense.
It would make sense, right? And also bringing more women in, but also one of the things that he wanted to do, and he mentioned specifically, is promoting more collaboration within the Roman Curia, because so far they've been, operating off what he would call as a silo mentality. People, 3 dicasteries can be in one building on different floors, and they never for 20 years interact with each other or have ever met anybody in the other day, a floor up or a floor down, and that was the case. When I got here 12 years ago, it was the case.
It's like Severance, right? The show on Apple TV. Have you seen that?
I have not, but yes, a bit like that.
It's like that.
It's like that. It's basically like that. And it's trying to break that down, which in itself, promote more collaboration and cooperation between the different dicasteries, which is something that in itself will change how the Curia works, and will change how it handles various issues. So that's something going forward I think is going to be very interesting, in theory, but also in practice, when we start seeing the real impact of it going forward.
Well, and you mentioned before something that Pope Francis was very strong about, is sort of an anti-clerical approach. And by that, we don't mean that necessarily just, that the priests are better or more divine or more holy, but that what we believe theologically is that, yes, somebody has to have the sacrament of holy orders in order to celebrate Mass, not to balance a budget or to run a meeting or to have strategy, and that we not only can, and again, it's not just a matter of, well, we don't have enough archbishops, so I guess we'll find some lay people, but maybe the church would be served even better, even if we have lots of priests running around going, I'd like to be in charge of that dicastery. Yeah, but it's the one about marriage and family life. Don't you think maybe we could have somebody who actually experiences that to be in charge of that? So, so that's a great piece to hear about, and it sounds like that's a strong piece of his agenda.
No, absolutely. And I think that's something, if you look at what he's done in the past and what he's been mentioning, in an interview like that he intends to do now, he was always involving lay people, and he was always putting lay people, but women, in charge in key positions in the Vatican, in the parishes that he ran, and also in his diocese, key commissions, in charge of universities, different in pastoral outreach in the diocese of Chiclayo was run by a layman, so in every juncture along the way, he's been doing this and putting couples in charge, so this is something, and he said that he intends to continue carrying that forward. And so I think this is something absolutely we can expect going, into the future. That's something, he's absolutely going to do.
Well, I have kept Elise Allen awake late enough on this 6-hour time difference as she joins us from Rome. She's the senior correspondent for Crux, the independent Catholic news service, and the author of the new and one of the first biographies ever of Pope Leo XIV. Leo XIV, citizen of the world, missionary of the 21st century. Very fascinating. Could probably talk for more hours, but you deserve your sleep, Elise Allen. So thank you for spending time and making the commitment to join us across the waters. And we'll talk to you soon, I hope. Maybe. How about when the book comes out in English?
I look forward to that very much.
Okay,
I'm
okay.
there. I'm
All
there
right,
for it.
we've got plenty more to talk about.